The ACC and Clemson and Florida State have agreed to settle their dueling lawsuits on Tuesday. They've got all their board meetings set up to approve the settlement. Pete Nakos, On3 national reporter, joining me as we discuss what this means. Who won this thing, Pete? Obviously, it's a settlement. There's no verdict. But who came out the winner of this?
The winner in this situation is Clemson and Florida State. In the future, they'll probably be winners when it comes to the uneven revenue distribution. But more importantly, in this situation, Clemson and Florida State are now set up to exit the league sooner rather than later if they choose to do so.
And there's a number. And I think that's the key thing here, because going into these lawsuits, if you read the ACC's original lawsuit against Florida State that they filed in North Carolina, there was no number. They said there's an exit fee that you have to pay that was equal to 3 times 3 years worth of conference revenue, which is like $120 million. But they basically said there's no number when it comes to buying back your media rights, which the schools had granted the league the rights through the middle of 2036. And they said, we would have to agree to sell them back to you, and we don't agree to that. So there is no number. Now there is a number. So I've made some phone calls. I've talked to some people. The number I've been told, if you wanted to do it right now, if you wanted to exit the ACC right now, is about $200 million. That's pretty expensive. Probably too rich for everybody involved. But the number, if you were wanting to exit after the 2029-2030 school year, is below $100 million. Now, what is important about that particular date, Pete?
So that timing lines up specifically with when the Big Ten television deal expires, allowing there to be more conference realignment. And, more importantly, Andy, it sets the timeline now for when schools can leave the ACC, and it gives them the time to get these dollars together to leave if they wish to.
Right. And it also gives them a chance to see what's going on because, right now, you don't want to be Florida State right now. Florida State just went 2-10 in football. They would much rather be coming off something like the 13-1 season they had the year before. They can't be 2-10 the next few years and expect this to all work out for them. So they got to get back on track. Clemson just needs to keep doing what it's doing. Meanwhile, we've talked about Florida State and Clemson because they're the ones who sued, but they're not the only ones involved in this thing. North Carolina is a major brand. We've been told they're coveted by the Big Ten and the SEC. Virginia, coveted by the SEC in the past. Miami had its resurgence in football as a big national brand. And it's interesting because we talked about the uneven revenue sharing. So the way that works is the schools that win the most and get the highest TV ratings will tend to get more money. And this is mostly in football, somewhat in basketball.
Right.
So you could potentially make, $15 million more a year. The average ACC distribution was $44.5 million in the most recent year. So you could go up to, say, $60 million, which would put you right now about where the Big Ten is. But once all the new Big Ten money kicks in, you're probably going to be a little bit behind that. But you're much closer. So if the market for Big Ten rights is flat and the Big Ten doesn't want to expand, then you still got something workable. But if the Big Ten media partners liked what they got, want to pay some more money, or Netflix wants to jump in and pay some money, or Amazon Prime, then if you're Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, maybe even Georgia Tech, which had some of the highest ratings of anybody this year, maybe then you're thinking about some stuff.
Yeah, and you mentioned Georgia Tech, obviously the highest rated program in the ACC this year.
In TV ratings, they had the big Week 0 game against Florida State. They had the 8 overtime game against Georgia. Yeah, they people were watching the Yellow Jackets.
So you look at that, and then you look at Miami and Clemson and Florida State and North Carolina, like you all mentioned. All those programs will probably be ripe for realignment when 2030 comes around. And we're not saying on here right now that they're definitely going to leave. But all those brands are going to be very attractive, especially if Florida State gets back to a winning way when the Big Ten deal comes up and they can leave the ACC. And the other factor in all this, too, is what does the SEC do, right? Obviously, the SEC TV deals through 2034. But Greg Sankey has proven time and again that he's not going to fall behind the Big Ten. Obviously, they set off realignment when they brought in Texas and Oklahoma. And now there's going to be an interesting situation in the upcoming years where the SEC is going to have an opportunity, if they choose to do so, to not necessarily block the Big Ten, but make sure they step in so they don't fall behind the Big Ten in terms of adding schools.
Yeah, it's kind of defending your turf more than anything else. Like, obviously Florida State, Clemson in deep in SEC territory, Georgia Tech's deep in SEC territory, Miami too. North Carolina is not an SEC state, but that's why the SEC might be interested in North Carolina, because they would like to add those people in that state. Ditto for Virginia. So that's what makes all this interesting. And I think it kind of boils down to two questions, Pete. And these are questions that we can't answer really till like 2028 when the TV deal starts getting negotiated. But how big is the appetite for expansion in the Big Ten? Because let's be real here. The simplest way to boil this down is if everybody can make more money, they'll do it. And if they can't, they won't. Like that, it's pretty simple. And the second question, though, let's say the Big Ten does have an appetite for expansion. The second question would be, does the SEC feel like it needs to make a defensive move? Because the SEC's TV deal does not run out till the middle of 2034. If they were doing something defensive, they'd have to do it in the middle of it, which is not ideal.
Right. And the whole undercurrent of all of this also, though, is the fact that the new college football playoff deal begins in 2026. The Big Ten and the SEC will have a major divide when it comes to how much money they'll make from the ESPN deal compared to the ACC and the Big 12 and the Group of Five schools. So while what the ACC is doing with uneven revenue distribution is probably a step in the right direction, there's still going to be more money to be made if you're an ACC school and you're eyeing to leave the conference in 2030. So that's also what's going on here.
And the history of uneven revenue distribution in college athletics is not a great one. Like,
no,
it almost broke up the then Pac-10. When they became the Pac-12, they actually became an even revenue share conference. And then the Big 12 just existed in a period of strife until they went to even revenue sharing. And obviously that it still didn't stop them from getting poached, but it was a big problem early in the life of that conference. So it is going to be interesting to see how all this works out. It does give Clemson and Florida State some flexibility as they decide what they want to do, but also having that number, knowing what it is. So it's the way the settlement reads is it's a declining number. It declines each year. So you can start it's almost like going to your financial advisor and making a savings plan at this point. How we need this number by this date. How do we do it?
Or we need to secure private equity by the state or something along those lines.
There is that. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch, but this is the result that I think Clemson and Florida State were going for. I don't think when they sued, either one ever thought they were going to go to court and win.
Yes.
And, we said all along, we figured this was headed toward a settlement. And the reason I always thought it was headed toward a settlement is not necessarily anything with Florida State and Clemson. It's that the ACC's worst case scenario was so much worse than Florida State and Clemson's, because Florida State and Clemson's worst case scenario was you sue. If you lose, you're stuck in the ACC with revenue sharing you don't like until 2036. That is the worst possible case, which nobody's closing up shop because of that. The ACC's worst case scenario was everybody can leave and not pay you a dime. And that they could not ever get to that point.
Right. And they're not going to get to that point with today's news and tomorrow's vote.
Yep. They've given themselves a chance to survive with this version intact. But whether it does is kind of dependent on a lot of other things. Pete Nakos, thank you so much.
You bet.